I was 43 years old the day I found out my whole life had been built on a lie my own parents told without ever saying a single word out loud. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. My mother's voice was flat, the way it always got when she didn't want to feel something. She said, "Your father and I signed the house over to Danny. It's done now. We wanted you to hear it from us before you heard it from him." I remember standing in my kitchen, holding the phone so tight my knuckles turned white and just not saying anything for a long moment. The coffee maker was still gurgling behind me. My daughter was doing homework at the table, and she looked up at me because something in my face must have changed. "Mom," I finally said, "the house, the one Grandpa built." "It's not Grandpa's house anymore, honey. It's your father's, and now it's Danny's." "I want you to understand something before I go any further. This wasn't the first time. This was just the last straw in a pile that had been building for 30 years. And if you've ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, like the reliable one, the responsible one, the one nobody worries about because you never give them a reason to, you already know exactly how that phone call felt landing in my chest. My name doesn't matter for this story. Call me whatever you want. What matters is what happened after that call, because 3 months later, I found a letter hidden inside a coffee can in my grandfather's old workshop, and that letter didn't just change how I saw my family. It changed how I saw myself. But let me back up, because you need to understand where this all started. I grew up in a small town, the kind where everybody knew whose porch light stayed on too late and whose didn't. My brother Danny was 2 years younger than me, and from the moment he could walk, he had this way of making rooms light up. He was funny, he was charming, he could talk his way out of anything, and more than that, he could talk his way into anything too. I was the other kid, the quiet one, the one who got good grades without anyone noticing, who did the dishes without being asked, who never once got in trouble because I was too scared of disappointing anyone to even try. My parents loved me, I believe that, I have to believe that, otherwise none of the rest of this makes any sense, but love in my family had this strange shape to it. It always leaned toward Danny. When Danny wrecked his first car at 17, my father bought him a second one within the month. When I turned 18 and needed help with my first semester of community college, my mother told me, "We just don't have it right now, sweetheart, you understand." I understood, or at least I told myself I did. When Danny dropped out of 2 different colleges and moved back home at 24 with nothing but a duffel bag and a story about how the world had done him wrong, my parents gave him the guest room, free rent, and a used truck to get back on his feet. When I got married at 26, worked 2 jobs to put myself through nursing school, and never asked my parents for a single dime, nobody threw me a party. Nobody said they were proud. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I need you to understand the shape of the wound before I tell you how it got torn open again. My grandfather, my father's father, was different. He was the one person in that family who saw me, really saw me. His name was Walter, and he'd built the house I grew up in with his own 2 hands back in 1958, board by board, nail by nail, out behind the old orchard that used to belong to his father before him. Grandpa Walter used to take me out to his workshop on Sunday afternoons while everyone else watched football inside. He taught me how to sand wood until it was smooth as glass. He taught me how to listen for the second when a stew was about to burn. He used to say, "The quiet ones carry the heaviest loads, sweetheart. Don't you ever let anybody tell you that quiet means small." I loved him more than I loved almost anybody in this world. And when he passed away, 6 years before that phone call about the house, something in me broke that never fully healed. At his funeral, my father stood up and gave a eulogy about a man I barely recognized. He talked about Grandpa's work ethic, his stubbornness, his old truck that never wanted to start in the winter. He didn't mention the workshop. He didn't mention the wood shavings that used to get stuck in my socks. He didn't mention me at all. After the funeral, the house went to my father since Grandpa Walter's wife, my grandmother, had passed years before that, and slowly, over the following years, my father started talking about the house differently, not as Grandpa's house, as the property, as an asset. I should have seen it coming, I suppose, but you never really believe your own family is capable of writing you out of the picture until they actually do it. So there I was, 3 months after that phone call, standing in the driveway of the house I grew up in, because my mother had asked me to come help sort through some of Grandpa's old things that were still boxed up in the workshop. She said Danny didn't have the patience for it, and she didn't have the heart, and would I mind? Of course I didn't mind. That was always my role, the one who didn't mind. The workshop hadn't changed much in 6 years. It still smelled like sawdust and old motor oil, that smell that hits you right in the chest before your mind even catches up to why. I ran my hand along the workbench where Grandpa used to let me help him build birdhouses, and for a second I just stood there, letting myself feel something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Grief has this funny habit of hiding in places you don't expect. I thought I'd cried out everything I had for Grandpa Walter years ago. Turns out I hadn't even come close. I spent the whole afternoon going through boxes, old tools mostly rusted beyond saving, photographs curling at the edges, a stack of letters tied together with twine love letters between him and my grandmother from back when he was stationed overseas in the army, which I set aside carefully because I knew my father would want those, even if he never asked for them. It was almost dark by the time I noticed the coffee can. It was tucked way back on the highest shelf behind a row of paint cans that hadn't been opened in decades. It was an old red can, the kind with a plastic lid, the label long faded to nothing. I almost left it. I almost just grabbed it and tossed it in the donation pile without a second thought. But something made me open it. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep out the moisture, was a folded piece of paper. And on the outside of that folded paper, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, my grandfather had written 5 words. For my granddaughter, only hers. My hands were shaking so bad I had to sit down right there on the workshop floor before I could even unfold it. I want to pause here and tell you something because I think it matters. In that moment, before I even read a single word inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. I felt chosen. Just the outside of that letter, just those 5 words, made something in my chest unclench that had been tight for 30 years. I unfolded the paper. The letter was dated almost 7 years back, written not long before Grandpa passed. His handwriting had gotten shakier by then, but it was still unmistakably his, that same slanted scrawl I used to watch make grocery lists on the back of church bulletins. It started, "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means you finally found the one place in this house your father never bothered to look." I remember laughing right there on that dusty floor, one of those laughs that comes out halfway to a sob. He went on to explain something I never knew, something nobody in my family had ever told me. The house wasn't just his, not entirely. When Grandpa Walter built it back in 1958, he'd built it on land that had been split between him and his sister, my great-aunt Ruth, who I barely remembered since she'd passed when I was young. Ruth never married, never had kids of her own, and when she died, she left her half of that land and everything tied to it, to whichever one of Grandpa Walter's grandchildren, showed her the same kind of steady, quiet love she'd shown this family her whole life without ever once asking for credit. Grandpa wrote that Ruth had made him promise before she passed that he would watch and wait and see which grandchild that turned out to be. He wasn't allowed to just decide, he had to watch it happen. And he wrote in that shaky, slanted handwriting, "It didn't take me long to know it was you. It was you when you were 9 years old and gave up your birthday money so your brother could go to that baseball camp he wanted so bad. It was you at 16 when you drove 2 hours in the rain to bring your mother her medicine after she forgot it on a trip and never once mentioned it again. It was you, every single Sunday, sitting with an old man in a workshop when you could have been anywhere else in the world." I had to stop reading for a minute. My chest hurt in a way that grief and joy sometimes feel exactly the same. He went on to say that Aunt Ruth's half of the land, and a modest but real inheritance that had been sitting untouched in a trust account since before I was even born, all of it, was meant for me. Not split, not shared. Meant for me specifically because that had been Ruth's wish, and because Grandpa Walter had come to believe with his whole heart that it was the right wish. But here's the part that broke something open in me. He wrote that he had told my father about this arrangement years before he passed. He had told him clearly. He had explained Ruth's wishes, explained the trust, explained that it wasn't his choice to make differently even if he'd wanted to, and my father had listened and nodded and never once mentioned a single word of it to me. Instead, my father had spent years quietly maneuvering things so that when Grandpa Walter passed, the visible parts of the estate, the house, the land on paper, the accounts everyone knew about, all folded neatly into what my parents considered family property, to be handled and distributed however they saw fit. Which, as it turned out, meant handing it to Danny. The trust that was legally supposed to come to me, the one tied to Ruth's wishes, had apparently gotten quietly absorbed and reclassified over the years by my father, who had power of attorney over some of Grandpa's affairs near the end. Grandpa's letter said he'd suspected something wasn't right in his final year, that papers he asked about kept getting delayed or explained away, but by then his health had declined so much that he couldn't fight it the way he wanted to. So he did the only thing he could do. He wrote it all down, every detail, every account number he could remember, every promise Ruth had made him swear to keep. And he hid it in the one place he knew without a shadow of a doubt that my father would never think to look, because my father had never once in his whole life cared enough about that workshop to set foot in it longer than it took to grab a hammer. "I'm sorry it took this long for the truth to reach you," he wrote near the end. "I should have found a way to tell you while I still had the strength to make sure it stuck. I let my son talk me into believing there was still time to fix it properly through the right channels, and then there wasn't. That's on me, and I'll carry that regret with whatever comes next. But I need you to know something, and I need you to know it in your bones, not just in your head. You were never the one who got overlooked because you weren't worth as much. You were overlooked because the people around you were too comfortable leaning on someone who never once complained about the weight. That's not a flaw in you, sweetheart. That was never a flaw in you. That was them mistaking your patience for permission." I sat on that workshop floor until it was fully dark outside, reading those last lines over and over, until the words practically stopped making sense from repetition and just became sound. I didn't go back inside the house that night. I couldn't. I got in my car and I drove home with that letter sitting in the passenger seat like it was a person, like it needed a seatbelt, and when I got home I sat at my kitchen table and I read it 4 more times before I even took my coat off. I want to tell you the next part honestly, because this isn't one of those stories where everything gets wrapped up clean and easy the very next day. Real life doesn't work like that, and if I told you it did, I'd be lying to you the same way my family had been lying to me. The first thing I felt after the shock wore off wasn't triumph. It wasn't even really anger yet, it was grief. A fresh, sharp grief for my grandfather, because now I understood that he had spent the final year of his life carrying a secret he desperately wanted to fix and couldn't, worried that he was letting me down, worried that his own son was capable of something he probably never fully wanted to believe. I grieved for him all over again, differently this time, not just missing him. Aching for what he must have felt, watching his own family maneuver around a dying man's wishes right in front of him. The anger came later. It came in waves, usually late at night, usually when I couldn't sleep. I'd lie there running through 30 years of memories with this new information sitting underneath all of them like a current, and I'd suddenly see conversations differently, the way my mother always changed the subject whenever I asked about Grandpa's old accounts, the way my father got strangely tense whenever Aunt Ruth's name came up. Little moments that I'd always chalked up to my family just being private people, that now looked a whole lot more like people hiding something. I didn't confront them right away. I know some people might think I should have marched over there the very next morning with that letter in my hand, but I needed time. I needed to talk to a lawyer first, quietly, to understand what I was actually looking at, because a handwritten letter from a dead man, however heartfelt, isn't automatically going to undo years of paperwork. The lawyer I found, a calm, sharp woman named Denise who specialized in estate disputes, told me something that both terrified me and gave me hope in the same breath. She said letters like this, especially with specific account references and clear language about a separate, older trust tied to a named relative like Aunt Ruth, could absolutely hold legal weight, especially if there were bank or county records that could confirm the original trust existed. It wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be fast. But it wasn't nothing. It took 3 weeks of records, requests, old county documents, and one very tense afternoon at a bank archive to confirm what Grandpa's letter had said. Aunt Ruth's half of that land had, in fact, been recorded separately decades ago, under a trust with specific language about eventual distribution, at Walter's discretion, guided by demonstrated character. My father's name appeared on later paperwork as trustee, added not long before Grandpa Walter's health began declining. The trail wasn't hidden particularly well. I don't think my father ever imagined anyone would go looking. I don't think he ever imagined I would be the one capable of going looking. When I finally sat my parents down at their kitchen table, the same one I'd eaten 1,000 childhood dinners at, I brought the letter and I brought copies of everything Denise had helped me gather. I didn't yell. I want you to know that because I think it matters. I had pictured that conversation so many times in my head, pictured myself finally getting to say everything I'd swallowed for 30 years, but when it actually came time, all that anger just sort of quieted down into something steadier. Something that didn't need to be loud to be heard. I slid the letter across the table and I said, "I need you to read this." My mother's hands trembled as she unfolded it. My father just sat there, very still, like he already knew, on some level, exactly what it was going to say. The silence in that kitchen while my mother read stretched out longer than I think I've ever experienced in my life. I watched her face change, watched the color drain out of it in stages, and when she finally looked up at my father, her voice came out barely above a whisper. "You told me Walter changed his mind before he passed. You told me he wanted it split evenly, that he just never got around to the paperwork." My father didn't answer her right away. He looked at the letter, then at me, and something in his face crumpled that I had genuinely never seen before in my entire life. My father was not a man who cried. I had seen him cry exactly twice, once at his own father's funeral, and once right there at that kitchen table. "I told myself it was fair," he finally said, his voice cracking in a way that startled me. "I told myself Danny needed it more, that you'd always land on your feet no matter what, and he wouldn't. I told myself that so many times I think I actually started believing it." I asked him the question I'd been holding onto for 3 weeks straight. "Did you ever, even once, think about what it would do to me? Finding out someday that everyone decided I didn't need to be looked after, just because I never gave you a reason to worry?" He didn't have an answer for that, not really. He said he was sorry over and over in this broken, quiet voice, and I believed that he meant it, but I also understood, sitting there, that sorry doesn't undo 30 years. Sorry is a start, it's not a finish line. The part I wasn't prepared for was Danny. When my parents told him what had been found, what the letter said, what the county records confirmed, he didn't react the way I expected. I braced myself for anger, for him lashing out, for him accusing me of trying to tear the family apart over money, and there was some of that in the beginning. There were a few ugly phone calls. There was a night where he showed up at my house unannounced, half convinced I'd forged the whole thing, until I calmly handed him copies of the county records myself and watched him go quiet. But something shifted in him over the following weeks that surprised me more than anything else in this whole story. Danny came to my house one evening alone without our parents, and he sat on my porch steps for a long time before he said anything at all. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I always knew something was off," he admitted. "I used to feel it, like this itch under my skin, every time Mom and Dad handed me something else, another car, another chance, another excuse. I told myself I deserved it because I needed it more, but some part of me always knew you deserved it more, and I think that's part of why I never could just enjoy any of it." I didn't say anything right away, I just let him sit with that. "I'm not saying that to make myself feel better," he added quietly. "I know it doesn't fix anything, I needed you to know I saw it too, I just never had the courage to say something." That conversation didn't erase 30 years of imbalance between us. I won't pretend it did. But it was the first honest thing my brother had said to me in longer than I could remember, and honestly, that mattered more to me in that moment than any amount of land or money ever could have. The legal process took almost a year to fully resolve. In the end, with the county records, the original trust language, and my grandfather's letter all lining up, the portion tied to Aunt Ruth's original wishes was restored to me, along with the smaller trust account that had been quietly folded into the family estate years before. It wasn't a fortune. I want to be honest about that too, because this was never really a story about becoming rich. It was enough to pay off my daughter's remaining student loans. It was enough to finally take the pressure off my husband and me after years of working ourselves thin. It was enough to feel, for the first time in my adult life, like the universe had finally balanced a scale that had been tipped the wrong way for far too long. But if I'm being completely honest with you, the money was never really the part that healed me. What healed me was reading those words from my grandfather, over and over, until I finally let myself believe them. "You were never overlooked because you weren't worth as much." That sentence rearranged something inside me that 30 years of quietly proving myself had never managed to fix. I used to think love was something you earned by being convenient, by never asking for too much, by making yourself easy to forget about so nobody ever had a reason to feel burdened by you. I spent my whole childhood, and honestly a good chunk of my adulthood too, believing that if I just stayed quiet enough, steady enough, good enough, eventually someone would notice and reward it. What my grandfather's letter taught me in the end wasn't really about the land or the money at all. It was that somebody had been watching the whole time. Somebody had seen every quiet sacrifice I never mentioned, every moment I chose someone else's comfort over my own, and had decided without me ever asking for it, without me ever needing to prove anything at all, that I deserved to be chosen too. My relationship with my parents is still healing. I won't pretend it's perfect. There are conversations we still haven't fully had, hurt that doesn't disappear just because the truth finally came out, but we talk now. Really talk in a way we never used to. My father calls me sometimes just to check in, which he genuinely never used to do, and I think in his own clumsy way he's trying. Danny and I are closer now than we've been since we were kids. He still has a lot of growing to do, and I think he'd be the first to admit that, but he calls me his sister now in a way that actually means something, not just a word he uses out of habit. And every Sunday, without fail, I drive out to that old property, the part that's mine now, and I sit in what used to be Grandpa Walter's workshop, which nobody else in the family ever wanted anyway, and I just breathe in that same smell of sawdust and old motor oil, and I talk to him. Out loud sometimes, like he might actually still be listening. I tell him about my week, I tell him about Danny. I tell him thank you, more times than I probably need to, because some kinds of gratitude just don't ever feel finished. And every single time, before I leave, I run my hand along that old workbench, right where the wood is still smooth as glass from all those Sunday afternoons, and I remind myself of the thing he wanted me to know more than anything else in that letter. Quiet was never the same thing as small, it never had been. I had just needed someone, one single person in this whole wide world, to finally say it out loud and mean it enough to leave it behind in writing, for me to finally believe it myself. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. If you're the quiet one in your family, the reliable one, the one nobody worries about because you never give them a reason to, please don't wait for a hidden letter to tell you what you're worth. You are not overlooked because you deserve less. You are overlooked because the people around you got comfortable leaning on someone who never once complained about the weight. Don't let that be the whole story of your life. Let it just be the chapter where you finally learn to put some of that weight down.